Good afternoon, my darlings. I am coming to you in the last full week of school. I'm sure you are all tremendously underslept and probably still pajama clad, and your head is racing full of all the things that you need to do. And I appreciate that you are showing up here, watching this video, learning something before the end of the semester. Um, so, as I mentioned last week and mentioned on this assignment, this discussion assignment, if you read that before, uh, we have two last days where we're going to talk about content that's in Blind Spot, just sort of pulling together stuff that's going to be the most useful for your paper, and then also spending the time to start building an outline this week. So, you should have a topic by now. Most of you guys have submitted it. Some people haven't, mainly because I messed up the due date. So if you're in the 2 o'clock class, definitely meant for that to be due on last Thursday. So I'm going to have my assignments open, and the second you submit it, I'm going to make comments on it. So you'll have comments on it by the end of the day, basically just saying like, yeah, that's great. A couple people you need to narrow just for your own benefit, just because this is a pretty short paper. And if you're just saying something like, you know, women are seen as less than men. I'm like, wow, there's a lot of ways that women are seen as less than men. Can we focus on one of those? I guarantee you it will be better. Um, so I was very interested reading about your IAT experiences. I shared a little bit about mine. I took a couple more, and I know that like there's my awareness of what's going on in them might be influencing my decisions, my like clicking and stuff now, but I still find myself skewing bias towards groups that I'm not even a part of. And so that feeling that comes from it, some people are legitimately outraged when they score a certain way on the IAT. And some people, it causes a lot of discomfort. The researchers and writers of Blind Spot, one of them is a woman and a woman of color, and she skews white bias and male bias, and also she scores male in science bias, even though she's a female scientist. So it's wild, and I think it's so important to emphasize that we're products of a culture, and of course we're products of our individual families, and the values that were raised there. I shared that my father's family is super racist, even though me and my parents are not. And like that sits in there, that settles in there. And it doesn't mean that it festers. It's just kind of like hidden in a little corner of like, cool, you heard this when you were younger, but it's the same with just our culture at large. So I want to talk about what's going on in our heads when we recognize that there is a discrepancy between what we believe, what we actually believe and feel what we believe, versus like how our schemas are working together to create an assumption. And this is probably one of my favorite chapters in Blind Spot, and one of my favorite parts of psychology, which is the automatic and the reflective preferences and systems, where we have these two things working, not working together, often working against each other, and where we can believe one thing and say, I know that I'm not racist, but then you might have that automatic thing that pops up when, for example, you see there's somebody, I forget who it was, somebody is doing how TV shows are encouraged, I think, her to focus on TV shows, um, sort of emphasize, blacks and Latinos as criminals, and a lot of it is by the dress. So when you see a Latino dude with a shaved head and a wife beater, there is an automatic association you make, even though that has nothing, and wife beater has nothing to do with criminality. However, we've seen that image so many times that may be the thing that floats to the top of your head, even though you know that thing's not true. So we are going to start by watching part of an episode of Seinfeld, where that deals with the same kind of concept, specifically with homosexuality. And I'm a big Seinfeld fan. However, if you go back and watch any 90s shows, whether it's Friends or Frasier or Seinfeld, there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't really stand up. There's really homophobic stuff. Whole episodes with plot lines about people being accused of being gay and then them proving that they're not, or it's always for the butt of a joke, and now that would not be appropriate. The same thing goes with other sensitivities or preferences. So it's interesting to look back. But I would like us to watch this one clip of an episode that's entitled The Outing. I think it's from season 4. And just as a preface, so Jerry Seinfeld is a comedian, and his friend and sometimes neighbor George is with him. They're at a coffee shop, and they realize that someone in back of them is eavesdropping. And so, to be funny, they decide to pretend that they're gay. I'm not really sure why that would be something funny, but again, in the 90s, that was. In the 90s, like, that's so gay was what everybody said at recess, which is hopefully people aren't saying as much anymore. Turns out that same person that was eavesdropping was a reporter from New York, from NYU, who was supposed to interview Jerry. And so we're going to see that meeting right now. If the video works, please say yes.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Sharon.
Hi, I'm Jerry. Something the matter?
No, nothing.
You look familiar. Have we ever met?
I'm not sure. Have we?
You look familiar. Why don't we do this over here?
Oh.
This is George.
Oh, hi. Nice to meet you.
He's gonna hang around if that's all right with you.
Sure, I'd like to talk to him too.
Oh, really? Okay.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
Oh, is that a problem?
No, I just hate my voice on tape. It always sounds so high and whiny.
Shall we start?
Fire away.
Okay, let's see. Are you just a comedian or do you do anything else?
Well, right now, George and I are writing a pilot for NBC.
Oh, so you also work together?
Yeah.
Jerry, did you wash this pen?
Yeah, I washed it.
It looks like it hasn't been washed.
So wash it.
You hear the way he talks to me?
You should hear how my boyfriend talks to me.
What?
Hey, let me ask you something. What do you think of this shirt?
It's nice.
Jerry said he didn't like it.
I didn't say I didn't like it. I said it was okay.
Oh, you said you didn't like it.
Oh, well, so what if I don't like it? Is that like the end of the world or something?
So how did you two meet?
Oh, actually, we met in the gym locker room.
Yeah. Actually, it was in gym class. I was trying to climb the ropes, and Jerry was spotting me. And I kept slipping and burning my thighs. And then finally I slipped and I fell on Jerry's head. Yeah, we've been close ever since.
Do you guys live together?
Live together?
No, I got my own place.
Oh. And do your parents know?
No, what?
My parents, they don't know what's going on.
Oh, God, you're that girl in the coffee shop that was eavesdropping on us. I knew you looked familiar. Oh, no! No!
I better get going.
There's been a big misunderstanding here.
Yeah.
We did that whole thing for your benefit. We knew you were eavesdropping. That's why my friend said all that. It was on purpose. We're not gay. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, of course not.
I mean, it's fine if that's who you are.
Absolutely.
I mean, I have many gay friends.
My father's gay.
Look, I know what I heard.
Heard. It was a joke.
All right, look, you want to have sex right now? Do you want to have sex with me right now? Let's go. Come on, let's go, baby. Come on.
Hey, come on, let's go. I thought we were gonna take a steam.
No, I don't want
no
any
steam.
steam. No steam.
Well, I don't want to sit there naked all by myself.
Okay. So there's a lot there. Obviously, the phrase, not there's anything wrong with that, is the big turning point where he realizes that what she's doing, and he does not want to be classified as gay. But then that very quick moment of there's nothing wrong with that, he truly, I believe that Jerry is gay friendly, and that he does not think that he has any complexes. Like, he does not think that there's anything wrong with it. However, again, Jerry's a product of a culture that has treated homosexuality as, at best, as a psychological disorder, at worst, at times of being morally deficient. And we do live in a Judeo-Christian society, and so the association of gay and sinful has persisted for centuries and centuries and centuries, and it's been relatively short in our recent history that it is not acceptable to think that publicly, and thank God for that. But it doesn't mean that that complex history is still gone. And so he makes that very simple, culturally potent association, and it doesn't matter if he reflectively, thinks that that thing is wrong, because you still see the shame. You still see George, with the panic in his eyes and saying, I'll have sex with you right now. Let me prove to you that I'm not gay. Thinking, yes, it's totally okay to be gay, but also, oh God, please don't think that I'm gay. And we know our reflective preference as well. We can talk about what we believe in, what we don't believe in. We can have really complex ideas about that. But our automatic preferences are kind of a mystery to us. Sometimes they flare up, and they're not bad. Like, they're automatic preferences are not terrible. They're the kind of thing, kind of like instinct, that can tell you when a situation is not what you want. There's people that we're interested in romantically or sexually, and people that we are not. And that comes from your automatic preferences. So it's almost like this, I don't want to say like, sort of marriage bouncer, but relationship bouncer of like, it's constantly sifting through people that you want to be around with or don't want to be around. Because it does have this mind of its own, and some of that is just sort of safety, which is the instinct. But I think this comes out a lot when we're shopping, and we'll sometimes impulse buy things and we don't really know why we did it. And that comes a lot from our automatic preferences. We'll like something and we don't really know why it is. We'll like a certain shape or color and we don't really know why that is. So that's the other side of automatic. And the authors of this chapter bring in a great question, which is, would you date an undertaker? So kind of a not culturally loaded thing like race or sex. We have certain connotations. We can bring in that C word of connotations with an undertaker, which is, ew, gross, like dead bodies. There's something very creepy about that. And I realized that one of our students wants to go into the funeral business. And so forgive us. And I think that it's wonderful. We love you, Ara. But like, those are automatic associations we have because of the way that we've seen undertakers, people who run mortuaries, embalmers. We see them in a certain light. And so reflectively, we're like, of course, there's nothing wrong with an undertaker. I'm sure they're very nice people, but the back of our head is like, oh, but they've touched the dead bodies, and that's just kind of like weirdly attached to them in some way. And so even for something small like that, we're constantly at war between the two. And so going back to the IAT, there's that moment where you recognize that it doesn't really match up, which a couple of you in your previous classes have read Malcolm Gladwell before. He's a wonderful sort of social philosopher, scientist, and personality. And he took the IAT, and he is a Black man, and his results were white preferenced. And so he literally said, this is so creepy. This is a creepy, dispiriting, and devastating moment. And it can be really, really creepy to think that there's a part of you that may even not prefer you. And that's uncomfortable to think about, that somewhere inside of you prefer someone who doesn't look like you, who doesn't have your identity. And so that moment is, again, incredibly uncomfortable. And that's where we get the term cognitive dissonance. So that moment is more like disassociation, where there's this crack in the system that you can see these contradictory attitudes that seem mutually inconsistent. And that's where you get cognitive dissonance, which is when there's the existence of both of these things, and you're aware of the existence of both of these things, which seem inconsistent. And that awareness actually violates this human striving for mental harmony or consonance. And it feels uncomfortable. That's definitely something that all of us have in some regard. And I'll share one personal for me, one of mine, because you guys know that I love teaching and I love my work, and that I'm also a fairly staunch feminist. I have a lot of contradictions about things like marriage and motherhood. It's not something that I want. However, there's also that sort of deep desire to also, be a mother and have a life of security. So it's very, and that's a very common one for women, because we've seen those two things put in opposition before, having a family versus having a career. And so that causes me a lot of discomfort. There is a cognitive dissonance of like, no, I've said that I don't want that and I don't, but then that feeling will flare up. And so be thinking about areas that you hold where cognitive dissonance has sort of reached its peak for you. And so questions that I want you to be asking of your topic now that you have your stereotype: does cognitive dissonance play a role in your stereotype? And what kind of automatic preferences fuel that persistence? Automatic preferences are at the base of all of these sorts of things, which, granted, there's a difference between just feeling that automatic preference and acting on that preference. And then lastly, what we'll get back to in a moment after I go into my topic, my sample topic I'm working with, is the stereotyping something that is active and aggressive, where we would see it as that sort of act of racism or act of sexism? Or is it something that's passive or invisible, even to the person who is stereotyping? So in that situation, I don't think that Jerry and George were really aware that they were being really, like, I guess, sexist or being discriminatory against gay people. They didn't realize it at all. It was something that was invisible to them, and it didn't really harm anybody. It's like, in that moment, there was not a person who was gay sitting there watching this display happen. But it doesn't mean that that thing isn't still important. So I want to talk about my topic. And so this I'm going to be following through for the next week with you guys. I'm going to, by Thursday, which is when I moved your paragraph outline, I'm going to have my own paragraph outline for you guys to look at, and you are welcome to start researching and building that. You could also do that during what would be our class time on Thursday. It's something you can pull together pretty quickly. So my topic is the stereotypes of female professors specifically. And I know that's kind of broad, so I know that I probably need to focus in on a couple of them, but this has been something I've studied for a while. You guys know how much I love words and how much I love connotation and studying connotation, and it kind of all converged into this topic for me. And there's a lot of research out there, even from gender bias that comes from students seeing a woman's name or female name on their syllabus. That can change the ratings of a teacher or whether they even decide to take that class. Probably not consciously, unless you're like a real asshole. That's something that's very unconscious of, I will take this class at the same time with this male professor instead of this female, for a myriad of reasons that stem into the cultural perceptions of women and intelligence and capability in higher education. So I want to look specifically at the language and student evaluations, and even more specifically at something like Rate Your Professor, which we've been on before. And there's not that much difference between like actual evaluations and Rate My Professor. I've been on a couple times. It's very fascinating for me. But the same kind of stuff you see. Oh, go back. Stuff you see in Rate My Professor is very similar to what you see in evaluations. And so this study was particularly interesting to me. It definitely verified things that I already knew, that men receive significantly higher scores on things like professionalism, promptness, fairness, respectfulness, enthusiasm, giving praise, just a lot higher than women, by 16%. Which is crazy. So women scored 16% less than men did, and that's not because there were less female professors. That is just across the board. So, where to go back? Where's the other thing? There it is. The stuff that they pulled out that I was like, yeah, that makes sense to me. Men were called professor more. Women were called teacher or instructor, which it seems like a small difference. But it is a difference. There's a difference between how you address somebody and the kind of respect that comes from that. There's a difference in how you talk about appearance or fashion. Women, female professors people comment on their fashion choice all the time. Women are called not nice. Even the phrase woman, which I think we talked about in class. I know that we've talked about this before. I found some more data, so I'm gonna pull it up. What's interesting is that there are ways to go about this to fix it. So those who had implicit bias trainings in with among their faculty, there were 40%, or along their faculty and along their students, there's 40% less teacher instructor language when used for women. So like that's pretty noticeable. And then there was I forget which university did this, but they changed the scale from a 10-point to a 6-point. So this is the original 10-point of like you've done an eval before of rating between 1 and 10. And here's the male versus the female. And then they changed it to a 6-point. And for some reason, like a lot of stuff happened within people's brains that there was not the same kind of hesitation for those raters to give a woman a top score, because we see 10 as being top. 6 doesn't have the same kind of weight, and people were more willing to give a female professor like full score without it seeming like, oh, they are the best 10 points. So very, very interesting how such an arbitrary thing would make such a dramatic shift. And so these are some of, I'm really trying to remember if we went over these in class. If we did, I apologize. If we didn't, I apologize for taking the break to try to figure out if we went over this in class. I covered this with my Loyola students too, since we do implicit bias, and everything is running together, much like the times and days. So my female colleagues and I pulled together a lot of different quotes from our student evaluations. This is a combination of I think 10 to 12 different female instructors. Some of these are mine. And so if you want to read them, they're very fun to read. So you can pause if you want. I'll just pull out a couple of them. So a lot of them, like, they're not bad, sweet and fun. That's nice. So cute. I love her. She really cared about us. That's so understanding. I love getting those comments. That's really nice. That's kind of, very caring and passionate. A lot of stuff questioning intelligence, needs to stop showing she thinks she knows more than us, or shuts down people's arguments, knows what she's doing, is a favorite of mine. But most people assume that a lot of people assume there was no information that came from it. Things like smiling more, a classic, really harsh, super bossy, bias, everything from women's rights view. She's so smart, or she knows her stuff. A lot of stuff about physical, wears jewelry, dresses, nice to look at. She cursed too much. That was one of mine from last year. She teaches pretty well. This was one of my colleagues who has children, and this one really grinded my gears. Found it very unprofessional. The instructor referenced her child as an excuse for not being available, or for missing class. This is not a concern of the student or any reputable faculty. Those issues should remain private, and availability should be clearly indicated without reference to the instructor's personal life. Yeah, that one made me really, really mad. So, just a little taste of the kind of stuff that we get, which I did not do a grouping of male professors, but I assure you, if you even try to put one of these into male faculty evaluations, I would love to know where you shop. You have some great suits. Men and women do have the same amount of like hot stuff in theirs. So cute. Total bitch, doesn't understand how to grade, really harsh, sweet and fun. Even the word sweet doesn't really sound appropriate. We don't use it for men. And I recently stumbled upon this fantastic site where I'll post it in our module, where you can type in a word and it will aggregate 14 million? I think it's 14 million. There's 14 million words. I'll look it up. I should have double checked that. It goes through just like hundreds of thousands of Rate My Professor comments, and it tries to figure out how words were used for which professors, which gender, and which subject. And one that people have been writing about a lot is genius. Men dramatically are called genius more than women are. Is it because there's not geniuses in the departments who are female? Absolutely not. Genius is a kind of a gendered word. We're used to geniuses being male, and that carries over into a male-dominated space, which is the university academia. Brilliant, same sort of thing. It's a bit of a smaller margin. Criminal justice actually seems to be this is progressive, fairly more progressive when it comes to male-female gender splits. Funny as well. And this reminds me of all the comedians who are like, oh, women aren't funny, which is absolutely not true. But there are just certain words that we use more for certain genders and certain fields. What women do get more of, though, are things like caring or sweet, a lot more for sweet, and nice. Does this mean that men are not nice? Absolutely not. So many of my professors who were male and nice. But do we evaluate women more on their kindness and behavior towards others than we do men within an academic setting? Absolutely. I have so many comments, which I like, about being caring, being nurturing, whatever, but no one would possibly use the word nurturing on a male evaluation. That's a word that we reserve for men. However, this is a professional person. They are not, somebody's nanny, and they're not a therapist, right? Where I do believe that it's important that we're caring for our students, but when you're evaluating the quality of somebody's teaching, that's not really something that should come up. I'm not saying that you should stop using this. I'm saying that we should be conscious of the kind of language that we do use, because the opposite is true too. Just like we use nice more for women, we use mean more for women too. Whereas even if a male professor is technically mean, we're more used to in our society interpreting that as sort of being gruff and being intelligent and being professional and being no nonsense, and that's actually a positive. That meanness for a man is a positive, where for a woman it's like, well, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, which is being caring, because you're a woman. Now, do I think that people evaluating these different professors were like, oh, this woman's mean and I don't like her and it's because she's a woman, I'm going to say that she's mean? No, I don't think so. This is very much so at the automatic associations. Same thing with the word harsh, not quite as much, but still present. Of course, my favorite is bossy, a very gendered word. I think many of the women in our class have been called bossy at one point or another for simply expressing how you feel about something. The relationship of women and authority in academia is rather flawed, again, because of this notion that women should be more caring. And so when a woman asserts more authority over a class, that is interpreted as being mean instead of being in control. One area that's super problematic is questioning the capabilities of a female professor to be unbiased. So bias comes in a lot, not as much, but still dramatically more in political science, which is, I think it's fascinating even to see how much, I mean, I guess that makes a little bit more sense because you're talking about politics, but even sociology, that's very interesting philosophy to bring in. Biases here are usually used, and I was able to select bias in a positive tone or bias in a negative tone, and this was bias in negative. But unfair definitely comes up. More women within the universities I've taught at have grade complaints filed, and that does not mean that they lose those grade complaints. I would say most of them are won by the professor. Most grade complaints are won by the faculty, because a lot of times it's people who are just angry that their grade wasn't what they wanted it to be. But my first year of teaching, I had a student at Loyola lean over the podium during, I don't know what we're doing, if everybody's working on group activities, and he wanted me to change his grade from a C to an A, and his argument was to wink at me and say, come on, I know that you want to give me an A. That is verbatim. And I know men deal with that manipulation too, but this one I didn't even think about, children, complaining that they're being treated like children, which is not something people think about saying as much with men as they do with women. There was one more, I forgot it. Let me go back up. I didn't link it together. This is why these lectures are so long. Not prepared. dramatically more women. There's a little bit more of a smattering in there, but the assumption that that the woman is not qualified to teach this course. Engineering, look at that. That is unreal. 10 million. Or 10 per millions words of text. Unreal. Same with here. Flustered, physics, engineering, chemistry, mathematics, economics, computer science, sciences. Ladies going into the sciences, men going into the sciences. Recognize this. Recognize that this is how your colleagues are going to be perceived. And we have a great responsibility to make sure that that our partners, in the field are being viewed for their work. And same with unprofessional. Pretty clear split down the side. I'm surprised that education actually is so far. All right, I know I'm spending a while on this. I had a lot of fun. And then stylish, always dramatically more than men. In the same way, also frumpy. So the inverse of stylish. Is that bad? No. It is nice to be complimented for being stylish. However, it does show that you are being evaluated for the way that you are, the way that you look. Anyways, so I want to do my paper on that because when I ask the question, does any of this matter? Like, yeah, you notice it. You're like, okay, cool, people are using those words, but like, all right, those are just words. They're not going to do anything. It does actually. The comments that students leave can affect your enrollment. If you're posting a bunch of stuff about how horrible a professor is, and there's a lot of those comments, or even just one of those comments, it could turn somebody away from taking that class, and classes are cut by lack of enrollment. It keeps women out of advancing in their careers or from their tenure reviews. So that's a whole other conversation of what happens within faculty evaluations from faculty to faculty, the kind of language that's used. If you're interested in this, I have lots of things to send you. And even when you're given classes for each semester, it could end up being less based off of people, comments that have been made about you. And so directly, these don't do anything. If I get a negative comment, if somebody gets a negative comment, or if somebody says I'm stylish, that is not bad. But there is this idea that it's this very small thing that shows, yes, you are different. We view you as different. We evaluate you differently. And so many of us have heard the term microaggressions, which is something to definitely think about within your stereotype. What are the macroaggressions? What are the microaggressions? A lot of you guys are dealing with actual hostility, which would be more of a macroaggression. A lot of you guys are dealing with these really small reminders that build up and erode a lot of how people within that group feel about themselves and how they're viewed by their society. So microaggressions can be verbal and can be nonverbal. They do communicate, whether that's very openly or not, negative, hostile, derogatory messages that's rooted in a group membership of some kind. And keep in mind, that can also be something like age. So even though we're looking at things like racism and sexism, those are some of the easiest ones to find. Those are not the only kinds of microaggressions that exist out there. And these can be intentional or unintentional. I would say more often than not, I experience unintentional ones, which is that person at fault. That gets pretty iffy of like, yes, they're at fault for saying the thing or doing the thing. Was it meant to hurt? Was it meant to emphasize the difference between people groups? No, absolutely not. So a lot of people have tried to make these more visible. A lot of different campaigns have had people write microaggressions that have been said to them on piece of paper. So BuzzFeed did one a couple years ago with some of the major ones, and definitely for people of color, you get so like, what are you? Especially if you're multiracial or biracial. And when I talk about words being important, pronouns and prepositions are important. What, not who are you, but what are you? And that came up, I think, in one of our logical fallacies, where if you can take away somebody's humanity in these really small ways and view them more as some sort of object or some sort of specimen. Do I think that the person asking this young man, so what are you, was thinking he was a specimen? Absolutely not. But the more times you're asked that, the more times it can send that message to yourself. And of course, the classic, where are you really from? Where are you from? Where are you from? Which I know I ask at the beginning of every semester, but genuinely so many people from IVC are from really rad places, and I like to know. So there's three forms of this. and we're gonna end very shortly after this. There's micro assaults. So this is, I would call these more macroaggressions. So old-fashioned discriminating. These are always conscious. Name calling, avoidant behavior, purposeful actions, actual like racism, actual acts of sexism, things like that. Then there's micro insults, which are verbal, and they convey those stereotypes, rudeness, and sensitivity. That could be either known or unknown. A lot of times it's like, no, I didn't mean to say it like that, or like, that's not what I meant. You mistook it. There usually is a little bit more of an edge there, but they are subtle. And then lastly, micro invalidations. So these are not so active, but it has to do more with neglecting or excluding. So what's interesting is that this could be the most damaging of all the three types of microaggressions. So this happens a lot in the workplace, or students have had this problem in group activities where there could be a certain person who's spoken over, interrupted several times, and the message that's received is your voice is not valid here. And gradually over time, that person just won't feel the same drive to share their opinion because it's going to be shot down and they feel more invalidated within that group. And so this one definitely has more of a potential, because it's so insidious, to build up that negative view of yourself. And so I come back to these questions. Lastly, is that stereotype something active or aggressive, passive, invisible, perhaps even those who are stereotyping? So after you go through this, I'm going to move on over to the discussion board, and you'll see the question there. But we're going to start using the discussion board this week to start generating some content for your paper. So I would like you guys to post your topic first of all, and maybe in your answers to the very short questions that are related off of this. Basically, how do you classify this stereotype? Is this something active? Is this something passive? And I would like you guys to comment back about your experience with that stereotype. So some of you guys, I know there's a couple of people writing about Muslims and terrorism. Some of you guys have maybe experienced things like that. Some of you guys have experienced some of the negative comments about being Asian American. So if you feel comfortable, if you could share your experience with that, or if there's anything else that you've heard that could be helpful, if there's something you saw on Twitter, if there's something that you've heard, if there's something you read in another class that you think would be helpful. We want to make sure that our class is conducting our discussion almost like a research pod. And so you can use quotes from this discussion board into your paper directly if there's, let's say, an example that one of your peers gives you, or maybe they'll even find a source that would be helpful for you. So let's make this as helpful as we possibly can for each other.